Well, good morning. Welcome to Catalyst. My name is Bill. Thank you for joining us for worship today, whether you are here in the sanctuary or you're joining us online via our virtual service. Thank you for being a part of the Catalyst family. Now, here at Catalyst, we're about one thing, and that is loving people to life change in Christ. So if you're here this morning, I want you to know we love you. But we love you enough to tell you the truth, which is I hope that you do not remain the same tomorrow. I hope that day by day, inch by inch, as followers of Christ, we become more like him as we learn more about him. And one of the ways that we transform our lives is by studying his word together. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. We're going to be concluding our Love Like Jesus teaching series this morning with one final message. I entitled this one, Story Like Jesus. And I know that story is a noun and I'm using it as a verb, but I'm not good at the grammars, and it's my sermon title, so you just got to go with me on that. So let me give you the key thought that connects this one to the previous messages. Here it is. The love of Jesus leaves behind lessons to learn and an example to follow. I know I've said this, I think each week, I'll say it again. I think if we could do nothing but mirror the love and compassion of Jesus, we'd be a whole lot more successful at evangelism. We'd be a whole lot more successful at leading people to know who he is, to learn what he taught, and to follow him for who he was. I think one of the biggest challenges is learning to love and balancing that truth and compassion. Jesus was 100% truth and 100% compassion all day. And I think both, if you over-accentuate one over the other, both are mistakes. You have some people who are so about truth that they forget to be compassionate. And you have some people who are so about compassion that they forget about things like truth. I challenge us this morning to be both. We need to be truthfully compassionate and compassionately truthful. So, that's the last time you have to hear that introduction, I promise. I'm going to ask you to turn in your Bibles with me to John chapter 9. Now, this is the Gospel of John. Early on in my pastoral career, I said, just turn to the book of John. And I had a young man in my congregation who came up to me after service. And he said, Pastor Bill, I think there's something wrong with my Bible. And I said, why is that? He said, well, you told me to turn to John 17. And my book has 4 Johns, and none of them have a 17. And so the Gospel of John is the 4th book of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We're going to go to the 9th chapter. You can see there on your screen, or if you're watching online at the bottom of the screen, we're going to be in John 9. We're going to use 2 different sections of John 9, and I'm going to explain why when we get there. While you're turning to John 9, let's review the big Bible story of how we got to this point. So here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He made a garden at a place called Eden, and in that garden he planted 2 human beings, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve then disobeyed God's instructions. Sin enters the world. They are pushed out of the Garden of Eden. You could fast forward a little while. Sin became rampant. God decided to give humanity a restart. He sent a flood. He chose a very special man, told him to build a boat that was called the Ark. That man's name is Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. They survived the flood. They begin to restart humanity. That's Genesis 9. Fast forward to Genesis 12. God selects one man and he tells him, I want you to move from Ur of the Chaldeans to the land that I will show you. And I'm going to make a covenant with you. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. Look to the north, south, east, and west. All this land I'm going to give your descendants. That man's name was Abram. Good job. And God changed his name to Abraham. Then God told Abraham, you are going to have a son of promise. It's not going to be the son you already have. It's going to be a son that I give you. And the son of promise born to Abraham was Isaac. And then Isaac's son of promise was Jacob. And then Jacob had how many sons? 12. And those sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. So as we get to the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob and his family all moves into Egypt. They survive a famine, which is ultimately what drove them into Egypt. Their younger brother had been sent there 13 years ahead of time, and then they survive, and that's the end of Genesis. There's an awful lot that happens there. Then 400 years go by, and the children of Israel now enslaved in the land of Egypt. They cry out to their God, we need a deliverer, send us a rescuer. And God sends them a shepherd from the land of Midian who saw a burning bush, and God told him to go back to Egypt, and that dude's name was Moses, whose brother's name was Aaron, whose sister's name was Miriam, that's right. And Moses and Aaron, they perform the miracles, which we know as the 10 plagues of Egypt. They part the Red Sea, they leave. Miriam leads the women of Israel in worshiping God, and that trio of two brothers and a sister lead God's people out of the nation of Egypt, and they should have gone right into the promised land, but unfortunately we have an obedience problem, and they wander in the wilderness for how many years? 40 years. After 40 years, God raises up a new leader to lead the nation of Israel into the land of Canaan. His name is Joshua. That's right. Joshua leads them into the nation of Israel. They don't do a great job of moving in the way they're supposed to, and that starts the period of the Judges. The key thing you need to know about the book of Judges is everyone does right in their own eyes. Everybody did what they thought was right. It was very pluralistic, relativistic in its nature. That you want to understand relativism, go look at the book of Judges. It totally is in there. Then, after a while, Israel gets jealous. They want something like all the other nations have. What does Israel want? They want a king. They ask God to give them a king. He goes, fine, I'm going to give you a king, but you understand. I was supposed to be your king and treat you rightly. You're going to get a human king. He's going to conscript your sons into military service. He's going to put your daughters into his harem, and he's going to tax the mess out of you. But since that's what you asked for, I'm going to give it to you. And the first king of the United monarchy of Israel is Saul, followed by David, followed by Solomon, followed by civil war. There's only three, they only make it 3 kings. That's it. This isn't the Christmas story. This is the middle of the Old Testament. They only made it 3 kings. And then all of a sudden they fracture and civil war. And the nation divides in 2. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. For bonus points, everyone but Casey, how many tribes make up the northern kingdom of Israel? 10. And how many are left in the bottom? 2, right? Anybody who can do the good math. 12 minus 10 is 2. Good job. So then they continue on as separate nations, and they still can't obey God. They still struggle to live in a way that pleases him. And he says, okay, fine, now I'm going to have to put you in a timeout. And God brings an external pagan nation to conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. What is the name of that pagan nation? Assyria. Assyria conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. That's like 722 BC, if memory serves correct. Then they go off into captivity. But the southern kingdom of Judah still is around for another like 100 and something years, till 586 BC. While they're in captivity, who defeats Assyria? Babylon defeats Assyria. Then Babylon marches down and defeats Judah, right? And they carry off. That's where the book of Daniel begins. Daniel and his cohorts are carried off into the land of Babylon. And then they're in captivity for a full 70 years. The entire nation is given a timeout from their own homeland. Then, while they're in captivity, Babylon falls to another pagan nation. That is Persia. Once Persia takes over, the lead king of Persia at the time says, listen, I don't need to keep everybody from their ancestral homelands. If you want to go home, you can go home. Cue Ezra, cue Nehemiah. Esther happens during that time period. So they come back into the land. They start rebuilding the land. There's Hezekiah, right, where they're building their houses, but not the temple. All of that happens there. They finally move back into land. They get the temple restarted. They get everything restarted. And then there's crickets from God. How many years of silence from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament? 400 years, that's right. For 400 years, God doesn't say anything to his people. There's no new prophets. There's no new scriptures. And then God breaks his silence by sending an angelic messenger whose name is Gabriel to the temple to speak to a priest who's ministering before the Lord. He promises that priest, you're going to have a very special son. The name of the priest in the temple who first heard God break his silence name is Zechariah. His promised son is named John the Baptist. He's the forerunner of the Messiah. After God sends that angelic messenger, he sends another angelic messenger to speak to a young woman named Mary and promises that she too will have a very special son who will be the promised Messiah of the Jewish people. And the name of Mary's son is Jesus. See, everybody gets that one. That's good. All right. Then Jesus is born. That's the nativity story, the beginning of the Gospels. Then Jesus, at 12, he's in the temple about his father's business. Fast forward to 30, he gets baptized. The Holy Spirit descends upon him like a dove. And then his ministry begins right at about the age of 30. And that's where we're at in the story. If we didn't do that every single week, you could get tempted to myopically only look at this one part of the Bible and not realize that it's all connected. And not realize that what God's doing in the New Testament echoes through things he's already done in the Old Testament, and promises that he made in the Old Testament find the fulfillment in the New Testament. I also just want to point out, if this is your first Sunday, I did not expect you to get all of those things right. But we've been doing that little story for like 2 years. And just each week we just review and we review. And then everybody starts to have a framework for when you approach the Bible, here's how it all fits together. So now, we are in the earthly ministry of Jesus. Jesus is born at or about, I'm going to go with 4 BC. For what I've been able to study, Jesus is born at about 4 BC. And I believe that the crucifixion and the resurrection happened in AD 30. There's only really 2 choices. You can have AD 30 or you can have AD 33. Scholars are divided on which one's the most accurate. In fact, I was just reading a book while on vacation. Dottie, this will tell you how much of a nerd I am. I go on vacation and I take a book about the historicity of the resurrection. That was my vacation book. And even that particular scholar said, he goes, there's no really way to know for certain which one is right. I'm in the AD 30 camp, which means the resurrection happened on Sunday, April the 9th, AD 30. Jesus is born at or about 4 BC is where I'm going to go with. Here we're in John chapter 9. I'm going to read verses 1 to 12, and then I'm going to jump down to verse 35. And I'm going to tell you why, so it makes sense. I want us to look at Jesus' conversation and ministry to this man who was born blind. But the middle of John chapter 9 involves the investigation of his healing, and the Pharisees and his mother and father get called to the temple. I want to skip the investigation because I want us to just focus on Jesus and ministering to this man born blind. So we're going to read verses 1 to 12, and then we're going to jump down to 35 and finish the story, 35 to 41. So here we go, John chapter 9, starting in verse 1. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground and made some mud with the saliva and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit begging? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no. It only looks like him. But he himself insisted, no, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened? They asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go wash. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know. Now we jump down to verse 35, and we pick up the story with Jesus and the man. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. This is out of the synagogue. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment, I have come into this world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. So now let's rewind back to the top of this chapter, and let's sort of walk through this a little slower and unpack this. So starting in verse 1, as he went along. This is another one of these fantastic on-the-way kind of stories. There's a lot of on-the-way stories in the Gospel of Luke. This one happens to be in John. I just want to point out, this is not like a scheduled appointment, right? So the man born blind did not send Jesus a quick text message and an appointment request and got on Jesus' calendar when he happened to be walking by. This is literally just as life happens. He was on the road. Along the way, Jesus happened to come across a man blind from birth. The other thing you need to know going into the story from verse 1 is, number one, this is an on-the-way story. Number two, the man is absolutely blind from birth. That's key to the rest of the story because the healing doesn't seem nearly as miraculous as if somebody just threw some dirt in your eyes you can't see and now all of a sudden the dirt's out of your eyes, right? No, John wants us to know for certain that this man is blind from birth. Now, given the fact, who wrote the Gospel of John? Great. Kellyanne was fast on the which, pow, John, right? I would submit, yes. I think the man who wrote the Gospel of John is the same man who wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and also wrote the book of Revelation. That is the Apostle John. That is the same John whose brother is James, whose father is Zebedee, who got called by Jesus and said, I will make you fishers of men. So even though John is writing his gospel much later in the 1st century, John's probably written in the late 80s to early 90s, right before the turn of the century, we're still reading the tale of somebody who was there the day, right? Because it says, as he went along, he, Jesus, saw a man blind from birth. Verse 2, his disciples asked him. Now it just says his disciples. John is not super clear of which disciple. And I would also point out, anytime you see the word his disciples, that likely includes a larger amount of people than just the named 12 apostles. There were women who regularly traveled with Jesus during the Gospels. There were women who funded his ministry. So just because we see his disciples does not mean that it must be restricted to only the named apostles that we know of. There were a lot larger group of followers of Jesus. And his disciples ask him a very pointed question. Rabbi, they're placing themselves under Jesus' teaching, right? Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Now, what this question illustrates is the theological viewpoint of the disciples in the 1st century while following Jesus. What is their viewpoint? They believe that personal illness is the result of personal sin. You see that? Well, I mean, this man was born blind. Now, what's super interesting is they actually give the option for it to be the man's own sin, but he was born blind. So then you're saying, wait a minute, so, he somehow committed a sin in utero in order for it to be his sin causing him to be born blind. Like, I don't think they thought their viewpoint all the way through, but the idea is still true today. There are still people, I have gone to churches where people still try to sell the idea that your individual sickness is directly related to your individual sin. So let me just deal with this one off the top. This is not what the Bible teaches, and here I can tell you why. When did sickness first enter the world? Way back in Genesis chapter 3, when sin entered the world for the very first time. And now let's take the word sin out of the sentence. When disobedience towards God happened for the first time, right? Because people want to get all up in arms about the word sin. The word sin literally means making any choice that's not in line with God's design. The way I try to teach my children is when you choose your desires over God's design, that's out of whack. Right? That's what they did in Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, sickness and death entered the world. From Genesis 3 until the point of the new creation in Revelation chapter 20, we live in a world that sickness is a reality. So I can't pass by this verse and not challenge this notion that our personal sickness is due to our personal sins. Because Jesus didn't let it stand. And I also, for any of you who have ever been blamed, if you just had more faith, you wouldn't be sick. Don't come at me with that. Let's not do it. Let's not go. That's not going to be good for you. No. I might have spent 7 years of seminary, but I was raised in Jersey. Let's not do this right now. Okay? That really gets on my nerves. And you know why it gets on my nerves? Let's just put the Pastor Bill hat down for a second. Let me just be really raw Bill. You know why that hurts? My mother died of cancer when I was 9 years old, when I went to a church of 300 people who prayed for her to be healed, and she wasn't. So you want to come at me with the idea? Because then the question is, if I have to believe that if I put my mom right here in this sentence, did my mom die because of my sin or her sin? Or because we live in a world of sickness and that's why we need a God who heals? That makes a whole lot more sense. But if anybody has ever tried to blame your sickness on your personal sin, you go tell them to shove it and call me. Because that's just not okay. Because then we end up throwing guilt at people who need love. We end up throwing harm on people who need healing, all because we want to justify ourselves that I'm healthy because I'm righteous. right? If I can blame your sickness on your sin, I can take credit for my health on my personal holiness. That's not okay. We live in a world of sickness because of what happened in Genesis 3. And we're promised a world without sickness and death because of what Jesus did in the Gospels, not because of what I did on Tuesday. Sorry, that's just really irritating to me. So we'll put the soapbox back over there. We'll put the hat back on. We'll actually try to finish the sermon. So this is what I wrote here. Sin brought sickness and death into the world, and that's the world we live in now. We do not need to blame individual or personal sin to explain or understand sickness in our current world. I would add to that, we do not need to add our sin against Jesus' sacrifice. He's the healer, and we're the ones who get healed. Then we go to verse 3, and Jesus doesn't let this idea stand either. Neither this man nor his parents sin. Immediately he goes, no, you just got that wrong. It's not either way. Why? And in this particular instance, now I'd also say, let's not decide that we get to take this verse and paint it over everybody's life as well, right? So, neither this man nor his parents, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. I would submit to you, I'm way more comfortable saying that this is a divinely appointed moment scheduled during the earthly ministry of the Savior. I have a hard time telling somebody God's letting you be sick so he can be glorified. No, sickness entered the world in Genesis 3 as a response to sin. That doesn't mean that God's healing doesn't bring him glory. It just means that if I catch a cold, I'm not going to blame my own sin, and I'm not going to blame God's glory because I'm sick. No, Kleenex makes money because I'm sick. Vicks Vapor Rub makes money because I'm sick. Sudafed makes money. NyQuil makes money. Jesus can be glorified whether I'm sick or whether I'm healed. So then Jesus says, and this is how he explains in verse 3, but this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. But Jesus is not done explaining himself, so don't disconnect 3 from 4. Here comes 4. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. 5, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Put all of those together, what is Jesus saying? I know it's very famous to hear Jesus is the light of the world. Sure. But what's the verse before that? He said, as long as it is day. What is day? Now, also I got to point out, light, day, night, dark. Those are very big themes in the Gospel of John. So if you ever want to do yourself a favor, sit down and read the entire Gospel of John and look at the number of times light and dark and day and night are contrasted. It's a big theme in John's writing. But here, what Jesus is saying is, if I am the light of the world, this is Jesus saying, not Bill, not Pastor Bill, Jesus. If I am the light of the world, then what time of day is it when the light is in the world? It's daytime. That's what he's saying. This happened. This man was born blind at this time during the daytime because I am the light of the world and I am here, but night is coming. Now, what is night? If Jesus being in the world is the light of the world, which makes daytime, then what is nighttime? It's at his crucifixion. That's when he is no longer physically on earth the way he is at this moment when he says this sentence. He's physically walking. He is the historical Jesus. He's in first century Jerusalem, and he's saying, I am the light of the world. That means I'm the light, therefore it's day. But there's coming a moment when the light's not going to be here, right? And that's night. So that's where all of this comes from. That's why it's important to get the theme as we're going through. Night is coming. Night is the time of Jesus' crucifixion when his earthly ministry comes to an end. Now, I would submit to you that theologically, Jesus' entire ministry did not come to an end. His earthly ministry does, because he's no longer in the same earthly form that he was in during the Gospels. But if you were to turn to the introduction to the Gospel of Luke, for instance, Luke tells us, in my former book, Theophilus, I told you about all that Jesus began to do and teach. And I carefully investigated everything so that you will know the truth. The book of Acts is what Jesus continues to do through his church, all the way to today, with me and you and us being right here in this church. Jesus is continuing to minister to the world, but rather than be in his physical form, walking and talking as he was in this instant, Jesus has now embodied the Spirit in his church to accomplish his mission. So Jesus' work is not done, but we are no longer in the presence of the earthly Jesus, so you and I would still technically be nighttime if we're following Jesus' analogy. So nighttime, that gets us 5. I am the light of the world. That gets us to 6. After saying this, hold on just a second. And then you turn off the mic so the online audience can't hear your really bad jokes. So he says the night, the dark, the I am the light of the world, all to get us to verse 6. After saying this, he spat on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Let's connect that to 7. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. Stop. Does anybody else just wonder the question and go, what? Like you read it, and it's Jesus, so you really don't want to question him, right? Because he's Jesus. But does anybody else down for like mud spit on their face? Like, let's not dehumanize what's happening here. This is Jesus. He is the Son of God, yes, but he's also fully man. He's fully human. What did he have for breakfast that day? Right? What did the mud smell like? There are realistic things that happen. The other thing is this. Does Jesus need the mud to heal the man? No. So then him choosing it is a choice. Right? There's plenty of times Jesus just spoke a healing. There's times that Jesus touched and healed. I think if you really want to do yourself a favor, you could go look at all the healing stories in the Bible and look at how they're different. Sometimes Jesus just speaks, the Roman centurion, fine, your servant is healed. Sometimes Jesus touches, like the man with leprosy. Why? Because he proves your uncleanliness doesn't affect me. My holiness affects you. In this instance, Jesus chooses to bend down, grab some mud, spit on it, grab some dust, spit on it, make mud, and put it on the man. I have to ask the why question. Why does Jesus choose this method of healing when pretty much any other method would have been available to him, including all the ones we've already seen? Here's my best answer. I'm going to answer it 2 different ways. First, I'm going to answer it theologically. I don't necessarily think that his disciples understand this, but I think with the 2,000-year lens on watching what Jesus does, I think we can see a theological understanding that they can't. And that is Jesus is identifying himself as the master potter who created humanity, right? He's creating clay by creating the mud and the saliva. He's literally taking the same 2 ingredients that made Adam, the dust of the earth, and part of God, and put it together, right? So theologically, I think Jesus is identifying himself as the master potter and creator of humanity. Did his disciples get that right when Jesus spat down in the mud? I don't know. But I think we can see that with our long lens. However, there's something more concurrent that Jesus is doing. And I think that Jesus, and this is what I call making a moment. Jesus is making a moment, but it's not the moment right now. It's a moment that happens in a minute. Jesus is making a moment, namely, the moment when a random blind man walks into the pool of Siloam and walks out sighted. By Jesus choosing to heal this way, by choosing to make the mud and apply it to the man's eyes and send him away, Jesus is making that moment a reality by making his choices here. That, to me, they would have seen. That's the first century view that they would have got. Even though I think theologically I'm correct, Jesus using the same things as Adam, it preaches great, it feels good, it's preacher speak, it's theologically right, but missiologically, Jesus is doing something with the way he heals this guy, and he makes that moment over there at the pool of Siloam, which gets us to verse 10. He says, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, Siloam which means sent. So the man went, he washed, and he came in seeing. The moment of verse 7 is made in the choice of verse 6. You see that? Right? By choosing to heal with the spit mud, Jesus creates the moment over at the pool of Siloam where Jesus isn't even there and the man is healed. That to me is super, super awesome. Then in verse 8, I could totally see this happening. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? And here's what's cool. His neighbors are those who know his story, right? They know the man is born blind. They know that in this society, there is no Social Security. There is no, Medicaid benefits. He is completely living off of the goodwill of the people in his town. And he's been that way his entire life because he's a man born blind. So he was a child blind. He was an adolescent blind. He was a young man, blind. At a certain point, when his parents could no longer provide for him, he began begging in order to eat, in order to clean himself, in order to purchase clothing. He was always living off of the goodwill of others. And so his neighbors knew his story and knew him well enough. And then in verse 8, they recognize him. And in verse 9, some of them claimed that he was the guy, and others said, no, it only looks like him. And up to the point that he himself insisted, no, I am the man. Here's what's funny. The confusion over the identity of the man is because of the difficulty of accepting the miracle. Did he really look that different from blind versus sighted? No, he probably walked a lot different. His facial expression was different. He probably smelled the same. I'm just saying. He's begging by the roadside. I don't think grabbing the head and shoulders and hitting the gym shower is probably in his wheelhouse every day. And yet, they were willing to question their identity of him. They questioned his identity because they couldn't accept the miracle that had happened in his life. It's easier for me to assume that just can't be Megan. I know what happened in Megan's life, and she's too joyous now. I must be wrong. It can't be that God is that good. And that to me is a huge part of this story, is they are unwilling to accept the miracle, and that's why they misidentify him. And then finally, a couple of them who realize that it truly is him, and they say, how then were your eyes opened? The how question also illustrates the story change. The evidence that something has happened is undeniable, and now I need to know the rest of the story. For everyone who's older than me, that's the Paul Harvey joke. If you don't know who Paul Harvey is, you're a fetus. What I think happens a lot today is exactly what happened to this man. When people know you well enough to know your story, they're ready to hear your explanation. But if they don't know you well enough yet, they question your miraculous assumptions rather than accept your story at face value. I don't think God does that. I don't know you well enough. I think maybe you're misidentifying something. Maybe I'm misidentifying something. And because the story's not clear, the miracle gets questioned. So then we get to verse 10. They asked him, how are your eyes open? Explain to me if that is really you. If you are really the same guy that I've seen begging for the last 10 years, and now all of a sudden you can see what happened. And this is the only explanation he can give. The man they call Jesus. Why does he say it that way? Well, think about it. He was blind. He can't identify who Jesus is. The only way he knows, he said, well, it's the man that others called Jesus. He doesn't know him directly because he was blind when Jesus healed him. He was blind when the mud went on his face. He doesn't have the personal relationship with Jesus. He's just the recipient of the miracle. He heard those who knew Jesus call him by his name. He heard those who knew his power call him by his name. And he experiences Jesus do something in his life and still can't identify who he is. The best he can do is the man they call Jesus. He made some mud and he put it on my eyes. And he told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went. And then I could see. This man's explanation to me is golden. He was obedient in the very little bit that he could be. He couldn't identify Jesus. He never sat down and he never saw the feeding of the 5,000. He didn't follow Jesus and watch him do miracles. Jesus interjects interjects himself into this man's life in this one simple little thing, and he's obedient with the mud on his face. And then in verse 12, I think the most obvious question, Jesse, where he be at? The New International Bill version. So where he be at? Why in verse 12 does the blind man not know where Jesus is? Because he never saw him. He's blind. As soon as Jesus walked out of acoustic range, the man can no longer know where Jesus is. That's the moment that Jesus creates by choosing to heal in this very odd way. He creates the moment over there at the pool of Siloam where he's healed. He also creates the man's inability to identify him. Because unless he was face to face and could recognize his voice, it's the only way he would know who Jesus is. Now, we're going to skip verses 13 to 34. They recount an investigation done by the Pharisees into the healing. They reject Jesus as being sent by God because he healed on the Sabbath. We talked about all of that last week. I don't want to rehash it. The man accepts Jesus as from God because Jesus healed him. And so I'm going to just encapsulate 13 to 34 with this one simple thing. No amount of theological or apologetic argument will ever be more life-changing than when Jesus becomes a part of your life story. Okay? That we skip over all the way down to verse 35. Here's where Jesus comes back. Jesus now finds the man. If you've never read the story before, they investigate the healing. The Pharisees are unwilling to accept that Jesus is from God because he healed on the Sabbath. If someone was from God, they would totally do it my way, the way I say it should be done. And so since he doesn't play by my rules, he's not from God. And the man born blind, he goes, listen, this is the New International Bill version. I'm going to abbreviate it. But he said, listen, I don't know about all your Sabbath laws or whatnot, but I was born blind and I could see. So I'm pretty sure that God doesn't let people heal who aren't from him. That's the blind man's argument. I have experienced something that I can only explain as God. And so even though it doesn't fit into your religious schemes and your religious plans, I've experienced this man they call Jesus do something in my life that only God could do. And so I'm going to stand on my experience, the evidence from what my life shows me about who he is. And I only know this much, but I know that doesn't fit with what I know. And so they kick him out. And they actually call his parents at one point to verify that he's born blind. They call his parents and they're like, are you this man's parents? And they're like, yep. Was he born blind? Yep. Can you explain how he can see? Nope, he's grown. He can answer for himself. That's literally what his parents say. He is grown, he can answer for himself. I don't want none of that. Like, I am not going to be on your 2020 special. I'm out. And then we get to 35. Jesus heard. He actually, I have to give the man born blind a little bit of credit. He bucks up the Pharisees and he gets a little shaggy with them. And at one point he asks them, like, listen, he healed me. Maybe you guys should become his disciple. And they get ticked and they kick him out. So then 35, Jesus hears that they have thrown him out. And when he found him, they said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Now keep in mind, he's now looking at Jesus face to face for the very first time. But he doesn't know that it's the man who healed him because he never saw him before. And unless he could recognize his voice, that's all he's going to get. So Jesus walks up to him and he doesn't ask him, do you believe in me? That's key. He asks him, do you believe in the Son of Man? So there's two things I need to point out here with Jesus' question. The first is what the word believe means, because we throw the word belief and believe and believer around an awful lot in Christian churchdom, right? Are you a believer? Yeah, bless God, I'm a believer. We don't really talk about what believer means. So I want to really define this. So the Greek word that is underneath of our English word believer is pisteuo. And it is one of the key Greek words in the New Testament for placing faith or believing in Jesus. And here's what pisteuo really means. It means to believe, to accept, and to trust. All of that, put it in your smoothie and drink it in one shot. All of those words together. I believe, I accept, and I trust. The reason that I think those three things are important is acceptance is an intellectual act. Trust is a volitional act. It's an act of the will. So this is not just, well, I want to believe it, or emotionally, I think it's possible. This is actually emotional, intellectual, and volitional. It's a complete package of a human being. I intellectually accept that what you're saying is true. I will put my will and my trust, and I will step and stand on what I believe is true, and my heart also believes it is true. Too many times when we talk about, well, I believe in Jesus, and you leave it in the emotional category, right? You leave it in, well, I just feel like Jesus is the right choice. Well, to quote my daughter Zola, who's not here today, feelings don't make facts, y'all. I don't, and I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound really harsh, and I promise, like, it's not meant to be harsh. I don't care how you feel about Jesus, right? It doesn't change who he is. I don't care how we feel about Scripture. It doesn't change what it is. I don't care how we feel about the reality of hell or the truth of the Holy Spirit or any of these other things that Christianity gets into. Why? Because truth is not determined by how I feel. It's determined by objective reality. So when we use this word believe, when he says, Do you believe in the Son of Man? He's saying, pisteuo. Do you believe, accept, and trust in the Son of Man? Now, who is the Son of Man? The Son of Man is an Old Testament term for the promised Messiah of Israel. Those of you who like your notes, it comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13. And I saw one like the Son of Man approach the Ancient of Days. So Daniel 7:13 is where the term first shows up. What Jesus is saying here, and believing in Jesus is not simply knowing the details about his life, but it must include the placing and trust in who he is because of who he is. What Jesus is saying to the man who has now been healed, who was born blind, is, do you believe, accept, and trust in the Messiah of Israel? That's a big, big ask. And in verse 36, we get the man born blind's answer. He says, who is he? Why does he have to say, who is he? Because he was blind when Jesus healed him the first time. So now, Jesus is getting a second moment out of the first moment that he created with the muddy moment. By choosing to do the mud, he created the healing moment at the pool of Siloam, and he created this, or he allowed for this moment here that's recorded for us when the man born blind finally comes to the realization of who Jesus is. 36, who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe, there's that word again, so that I may believe, accept, and trust in him. He is ready to place his faith in Jesus. He doesn't know how to identify him. That's a big point. This man is ready to place his faith in Jesus, but doesn't know how to identify him. 37. You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Interesting fact, verse 37 right here is the second time in all of the New Testament that Jesus willingly identified himself face to face as the Messiah of Israel. The first time is in John chapter 4 when Jesus is speaking to the woman at the well. And he said the same thing, I who's speaking to you am he. This is the second time that Jesus identifies himself as the promised Messiah of Israel. And the first time was to a Samaritan woman. They weren't even in Israel. The second time, it's to a man born blind. How ironic. The man born blind now sees who the true Messiah of Israel is better than everybody else in the crowd. Because he says, I who's speaking to you am he. And then in 38, the man said, Lord, I believe. That word Lord there literally conveys submission to a higher authority. It was a word used in the Roman military. So if any of you have ever been in the service, when you are speaking to a commanding officer, right? Let's say you're a lower rank, you're down here, and you're speaking to a big higher rank guy, like a general level guy. When you say, yes, sir, it's not just recognizing his rank or his position. It's also recognizing my submission to your position, right? As a lesser ranking officer, I am under your command. And the whole conversation with the Roman centurion, the healing his servant, all of that comes into play with this word too. But this word, kurios, conveys submission to a higher authority. So when he says Lord, he is saying to Jesus, you who are my higher authority, your majesty. Right? We would say that in Arthurian times. Yes, your majesty, my liege. Those are all terms that not just convey your rank, but my submission to your rank. And he says, I, pisteuo, I believe, I accept, I trust. And then he worships. This is the moment here in verse 38 where I am totally willing to accept that the man born blind is now what you and I today would call saved. And how do I know that? Because salvation produces worship. He's born blind. He can't identify who Jesus is. His heart is ready to place his faith. He just needs to identify the right object of that faith. Jesus reveals himself to this man born blind, and he immediately accepts, trusts, believes, and then worships. And then Jesus adds what seems like it would be a really great sermon. I could just stop at 38, right? And the man worshiped, and I'm going to get you to identify with the blind man and place your trust and belief in Jesus and worship. But again, that's not what this whole series is about. This whole series is about us identifying with the way Jesus ministered, not just who he ministered to. So 39, For judgment I have come into this world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Jesus' ministry brought spiritual sight to those who had none and illustrated the spiritual blindness of those who willingly rejected him. And that's the section that we skipped. But you will see the Pharisees are willingly rejecting Jesus' identity as being from God. That's what happened in the verses that we skipped. You cannot get someone who is willfully blind to see, but you can get someone who's never seen before to see who Jesus is. And I would say this is a really big challenge for you and I today. Any of you who happen to watch my Instagram feed, I've had like a 5-day long conversation with a gentleman who's a Muslim who's trying to convince me that Jesus is actually a Muslim. And I just said, I think that's really hard when Islam as a religion didn't come around until like the mid AD 500s, and Jesus was born in 4 BC and died in 30 AD. And so then it's a very interesting conversation. You can go back and watch it. But I think there's a lot of people who are willfully blind, willfully reject who Jesus is. And those people tend to be the loud ones, right? So you got your Richard Dawkins, your Sam Harris, all of your super famous atheists. You got some famous members of other religions over here. We could throw Islam in that category, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, right? There are people who objectively reject who Jesus is. That's the Pharisees in the story. That's the section we skipped. But then there's this other category of people. And I think that category is a lot bigger than we let ourselves believe it is. And this category of people, and let's just do it this way. I'm going to describe a group of people, and I want you to raise your hand if you know somebody who fits this description. Ready? So this group of people, this is going to get really scary really fast. So this group of people, they're okay believing there's a God. There probably is a God. It helps them feel better. When they're sick, they like to believe in God. They're not really sure all that Christianity has to say. They're not really sure all that Judaism or Islam or Buddhism has to say. They're okay being spiritual, but maybe not religious. They don't necessarily go to church, but they believe in a higher power. Anybody know anybody like that? Right? No, just raise your hand. Who knows someone like that? That's literally almost everyone in this room. All of those people would be willing to accept Jesus if he identified himself to them. That's this guy. That's this guy. They're willing to accept that there's a God. There's probably a God, but maybe I don't know which God. That's a much better conversation than there must not be a God. Those people are what I would say is willingly rejecting. So how do we reach those people? How do we reach those people who would be ready to place their faith in Jesus if they could but simply identify him? Here's what I think. Here's how we love like Jesus from this story. Number one, Jesus responds to opportunities that are on the way. You need to realize that in your everyday life, you are walking by people who Jesus is ready to jump in their story, but you're the one who's going to have to step in. Number two, Jesus took note of the man's story as part of the mission. Jesus didn't just stop for no reason. He took part in the story, this man born blind. Number three, Jesus healed him in a way that rippled out from the one man. He didn't just heal him and move on. This rippled out. There was a conversation with the Pharisees. There was this, there was that. Number four, Jesus asked the blind man about his faith directly. And number five, Jesus did not hold back the truth from the one who was actively seeking it. And I think that's the harder part. How do you know? How do you know when it's ready to press the Jesus button? Number one, I would say you need to know the person. Like I'm just, and this may be offensive to like the old school saints, but I don't like street preaching. I don't find it to be very effective. I'd rather go sit at a Dunkin', get a drink, get a donut, and talk to somebody for an hour and a half about what they believe about God and find that road that's going to help weave Jesus into the story than go stand on a street corner and hold up a sign and wait for somebody to honk and argue and throw a burger at me. Like it just doesn't make any sense. To me, what Jesus does in this story that you and I can walk away with is he sees who the person is, he catches the drift of their life story, and then he weaves Jesus into it in a way that this man experiences miraculous restoration. Now, you're probably not going to run into 5 million people who are born blind and introduce them to Jesus and get them healed, but that's not the only kind of healing that exists. right? We started out by talking about that there's sickness all in the world. There's tons of things people need to be healed of. And if we could just get Jesus into their story. So as I invite the worship team to come up, ushers, get ready. Here's the takeaway as we bring this in for a close. Like Jesus, we live beside some who are willfully blind and some who simply can't see Jesus. It is our job to put Jesus into the story of as many we can and let them respond. That's what I want us to do.